God's chosen ones. Something in your spirit brought you here, didn't it? Something tugged at your soul, like a whisper behind the veil saying, "Watch this. This is about you." Because what you're about to hear isn't ordinary. It's not coincidence. This is revelation dressed in fire. And the moment you press play, heaven leans in. Because the truth is, you didn't stumble across this message. You were summoned. Let's be honest. You've known for a while now, something wasn't right. The smiles were too polished, the compliments too convenient. You could feel it, the shift in energy, the envy behind the applause, the plots forming in rooms you were never supposed to walk into. And yet, you walked in anyway. Not because you were invited, but because you were called. They underestimated you. They thought you were just another name on the list, just another dreamer they could mock from a distance. They laughed behind closed doors, thinking you'd never find out. But what they didn't know is, you already knew. Not through gossip, not through eavesdropping, but through divine insight. You saw the trap before it was set. You watched them build the stage and said nothing. You let them rehearse their scene while God rewrote your script. And now, that stage is yours. If you've ever felt that sting of hidden betrayal, if you've ever smiled back at someone you knew was hoping you'd fall, then drop 777 in the comments. Not just to claim your power, but to signal to heaven that you're done playing small. And before we dive deeper, allow me to say this with a full heart. To every single one of you who has supported this channel through super thanks, thank you. You are the reason this voice can keep sounding the alarm. You are part of the remnant who refuse to be silenced. Even if you've never donated, even if this is your first time here, your presence is powerful. Your presence is prophecy. Now, lean in, because this isn't just a message about betrayal. It's about strategy. It's about how God let them think they were winning, so you could study their every move. It's about how you let the fire burn just long enough to reveal the snakes hiding in the smoke. And it's about what happens next. When the enemy realizes you weren't a pawn in their game, you were the whole board. Let's go deeper. God's chosen ones, you saw their envious plot coming, and you beat them at their own game. You didn't flinch. That alone made them nervous. Because real ones don't react to chaos, they study it. They don't panic in the middle of noise. They become the calm center inside the storm. And you, God's chosen one, knew exactly what to do when envy came dressed as applause. When the air shifted, when the tension rose and smiles felt just a little too stiff, you didn't fight it. You didn't post about it. You didn't gather an audience. You observed, quietly, carefully, silently. Not from fear, but from divine clarity. You weren't just standing still, you were scanning the battlefield. Can a general launch victory without first surveying the enemy's formation? Even Jesus did this. In Luke 20:23 it says, "But he perceived their craftiness and said to them, 'Why do you test me?'" He didn't flinch when the Pharisees plotted against him. He exposed their game without ever raising his voice. How often have you felt that same inner voice tell you, "Stay silent, this is a setup"? You sensed the betrayal early, the tone, the glances, the forced laughter. You didn't respond emotionally because you knew something most don't. Reactions are data leaks. Emotional outbursts are readable. But composure, that's unreadable, that's powerful, that's divine. Look at how the prophet Daniel responded in Babylon. When they plotted to trap him through the king's decree, Daniel didn't protest. He didn't fight the law. He kept praying 3 times a day, as always. He let the trap fall into place because he knew the lions weren't his enemy. The real threat was spiritual, and silence was his shield. And in the end, it was the accusers who were thrown to the lions, not him. And what about you? How many times have people mistaken your quiet for weakness? How many assumed you were out of moves because you weren't making noise? But behind the scenes you were taking notes. You were tracking patterns. Their whispers weren't just rumors, they were roadmaps. Every inconsistency was a breadcrumb. You weren't confused, you were documenting. This reminds me of Howard Schultz, the former CEO of Starbucks. Long before he became a billionaire visionary, he grew up in a Brooklyn housing project. He once said, "In times of adversity and change, we really discover who we are and what we're made of." He wasn't loud in his early years. He was observant. While others dismissed him, he watched. And when his moment came, he moved with quiet brilliance. He didn't chase attention. He built something that made attention chase him. Isn't that what you've done too? And then there's Maya Bellin. You haven't heard of her, but you will. She was an assistant in a law firm no one respected, until one day, during a company scandal, she presented internal findings she had gathered silently for months. No outburst, no drama, just clean strategy. Now she runs that firm's ethics division. Her silence wasn't weakness, it was surveillance. You've walked the same path. While they shouted, you wrote. While they schemed, you studied. While they tried to throw you off balance, you recalibrated your inner compass. And when you moved, it was without noise, just results. Have they even realized yet that you were never rattled, that you were always in control? Isaiah 30:15 says, "In quietness and in trust shall be your strength." That's the blueprint you lived by. Still waters run deep, and you've been digging deeper than they ever suspected. Imagine the grace of a swan gliding across a lake, peaceful on the surface, but beneath the water, its feet are moving with intent, with purpose. That's how you've navigated every envious whisper, every passive-aggressive smile. Controlled on the outside, calculated within. And when the time came to act, you didn't swing wildly. You executed like a master. No fingerprints, no fallout, just impact. They never saw it coming because they were too distracted looking for your meltdown to notice your movement. You weren't surviving their chaos. You were architecting the blueprint. You didn't just endure their envy. You decoded it. And now, you've elevated past it, silently, skillfully, and undeniably. They thought they were whispering behind your back, but what they didn't know was that you were documenting the echo, not just hearing it, but tracing it, decoding it, and turning it into strategy. Their whispers weren't as subtle as they believed. You weren't merely present in the room. You were recording spiritual frequencies, tones, pauses, double meanings. The entire atmosphere was speaking, and you were listening with ears trained by survival. People like that always underestimate the quiet ones. They think if you're not reacting, you're not aware, but they forget silence isn't absence. Sometimes it's the presence of wisdom in disguise. Did they really think someone who's been through fire would be fooled by smoke? In Proverbs 26:24-26, the word warns us, "Enemies disguise themselves with their lips, but in their hearts they harbor deceit. Though their speech is charming, do not believe them. Their malice may be concealed by deception, but their wickedness will be exposed in the assembly." That's exactly what you understood from the beginning. You didn't need to confront them early because you knew truth has its own timeline. You let it reveal itself, one echo at a time. While they giggled behind screens and crafted vague captions with slick intentions, you were gathering patterns. That wasn't paranoia. It was pattern recognition. You weren't reacting emotionally, you were recording evidence. Every slip-up became a clue. Every backhanded compliment was another page in the folder. You didn't jump to conclusions. You waited for confirmations. Isn't that what spiritual maturity looks like? You saw the signs. Their tone shifted when others entered the room. Their enthusiasm for your wins came coated in sarcasm. Their support was conditional, their smiles tight, and their loyalty always negotiable. But you didn't need to call it out right away. You did something more powerful. You let them talk long enough to hand you the entire map of their motives. It's the same principle Nehemiah used. When his enemies Sanballat and Tobiah tried to sabotage the rebuilding of Jerusalem's wall, Nehemiah didn't descend into arguments. Instead, he said, "I'm doing a great work and I cannot come down." Nehemiah 6:3. You did the same. You kept building while they kept babbling. Their whispers didn't stop your purpose. They documented their own downfall while trying to orchestrate yours. Even in modern times, this pattern holds. Michelle Obama, former First Lady of the United States, once said, "When they go low, we go high." She knew the power of grace under fire. She faced constant attacks, coded language, and disrespect masked in civility. But she rose above it, not by ignoring it, but by outclassing it. Like you, she let the echo get loud enough for the world to recognize the truth without her needing to say a word. And I'll tell you about Tavius Reddin, a rising musician in Atlanta. For 2 years, his closest friends were secretly forwarding his unreleased demos to competitors, hoping to block his rise. But he didn't retaliate. He didn't out them. He kept quiet, studied the trail, and documented everything. When the truth came to light, through a major label accidentally CCing him in a shady thread, he already had the receipts. And just like that, he signed a deal. The same voices that whispered behind his back now echo in silence. How many times have you sensed that someone's support came with an expiration date? How often have you seen a smile that didn't reach the eyes, or felt a compliment that felt more like a warning? Instead of getting emotional, you became strategic. You let the echo swell. You let their contradictions multiply until even others began to notice. You didn't expose them, they exposed themselves. Because that's the divine law of sowing and reaping. Galatians 6:7 declares, "Do not be deceived. God is not mocked. A man reaps what he sows." You simply waited for the harvest. Every silence was a setup. Every pause was a page being turned. You didn't respond out of nowhere. You responded from a deep archive of context, and that's what made your movement so refined. They thought your calm was cluelessness. But what they didn't realize is that calm people often carry the clearest vision. Imagine a hawk perched high above a noisy forest. It doesn't flap wildly. It waits, still, focused, and when the time comes, it moves once, swift, clean, undeniable. That's how your breakthrough arrived. Not loud, but lasting. The same mouths that whispered about you now struggled to explain you. Because when you finally moved, it wasn't revenge, it was revelation. And the trail they left behind, you didn't just hear it, you turned it into a record, a reminder, a receipt, a trophy of how discernment always outlasts deception. You didn't match their energy. You redirected it like a black hole bends light and devours sound. While they hurled negativity, envy, and hidden shade like darts, hoping to provoke a reckless reaction, you remained grounded. Not because you lacked the strength to clap back, but because you had already graduated from that level. They were trying to pull you into chaos, to see if you'd swing wildly in the dark. But instead of swinging, you absorbed, you transmuted, you turned tension into transformation. Because real power isn't proven in how loud you get, it's in how still you remain when provoked. Isn't it fascinating how the most dangerous storms don't always begin with thunder, but with still air? You understood what many never will. Power doesn't always bark. Sometimes it just watches. And when the time is right, it moves once. With precision, you didn't get drawn into their emotional games. You didn't match their bitterness, their sarcasm, or their desperation to be seen. Why would you? You were already walking in alignment while they were still chasing validation. You handled them the same way Jesus handled the crowd in John 8, when the woman caught in adultery was thrown before him. The crowd screamed for judgment, for action, for a reaction. But Jesus bent down and wrote in the dust. He waited. He redirected their fury into reflection, and one by one, the stones fell from their hands. Because sometimes the most divine response is silence wrapped in discernment. You chose not to engage. That wasn't weakness, it was strategy. You weren't avoiding conflict, you were protecting your elevation. They wanted to knock you off balance, to derail your purpose. But instead, they became fuel for your focus. Their gossip became background noise. Their doubt became sharpening fire. And every time they thought they were slowing you down, they were unknowingly speeding you up. Nelson Mandela, imprisoned for 27 years, was hated, silenced and condemned by those who feared his vision. But he didn't return hate for hate. He emerged not bitter, but refined. He said, "Resentment is like drinking poison, and then hoping it will kill your enemies." You followed that wisdom too. You didn't hold on to their toxicity. You turned it into clarity. And have you heard of Larissa Vang? Just a few months ago, she was overlooked for a promotion in her architecture firm by a colleague who had been subtly sabotaging her. She didn't confront him. She didn't gossip back. She focused, worked harder, refined her designs, and 6 months later, when the client asked who had done the preliminary drafts, it was her name they remembered, not his. Now she's heading the firm's most lucrative project. He underestimated her silence. But silence doesn't mean nothing is happening. Sometimes it means everything is being prepared. What if all their efforts to stop you were actually repurposed by God to push you forward? Isaiah 54:17 says, "No weapon formed against you shall prosper, and every tongue which rises against you in judgment you shall condemn." Notice, it never said weapons wouldn't be formed. It said they wouldn't prosper. Why? Because when you're chosen, even their attacks can be rerouted into fuel for your calling. You moved with strategy, not spite. You didn't escalate, you elevated. While they were loud, you were learning. While they scrambled for attention, you were stacking results. And when the time came to move, you didn't need to announce it. You just ascended. Imagine a mountain quietly pulling every storm upward, shifting winds, changing weather, not by force, but by its very presence. That's what you became, a force of nature they couldn't explain. The more they came at you, the higher you climbed. They never expected you to grow from what was sent to destroy you. But that's what chosen ones do. You didn't just survive their noise, you transformed it into momentum. You turned their fire into forward motion. And by the time they realized you'd never been touched by their mess, you had already left the room. Mentally, emotionally, spiritually. You weren't just distant, you were unreachable. Because while they fought to pull you into pettiness, you had already chosen peace. And that peace, that was your power. They didn't lose because you attacked. They lost because you didn't. They mistook your silence for cluelessness. But what they never realized was that you weren't building alibis. You were building an arsenal, not of weapons, but of wisdom. While they whispered and schemed in dark corners, assuming your stillness meant ignorance, you were engineering something far more dangerous than a reaction. You were crafting strategy. They thought you were lost because you didn't shout. They assumed you were slow because you didn't sprint. But stillness is not stagnation. It's what the eagle does before the dive. It's what the lion does before the leap. Can someone who's already seen the ending be surprised by the chaos of the middle? While they plotted, you prepared. Not for confrontation, but for clarity. You were not dormant. You were developing, upgrading, fortifying. They spoke in code, thinking you'd never catch on. But you read the energy in their eyes, the slant of their compliments, the gaps between their words. You saw the trap and let them keep digging it. Because sometimes the wisest thing a chosen one can do is let ego run its course. Remember Esther. She stayed silent in the palace while Haman was busy plotting the destruction of her people. No one knew her lineage. No one suspected her plan. And yet, when the moment came, she spoke only once. But her words shifted a kingdom. That's the power of waiting for God's timing. That's the weight of strategic silence. You weren't defending your name. You were refining your voice. While they tried to manipulate the room, you were mastering the battlefield. You didn't waste time clearing rumors. You were clarifying your vision. Every passive-aggressive jab they threw your way became another sharpened edge in your mindset. You were letting them show their hand, not to react, but to reset the board, and you did it all without announcing a single move. Why? Because true strategy doesn't speak, it reveals. And when it doesn't beg to be understood, it just works. Angela Merkel, former Chancellor of Germany, was known for her quiet strength. She rarely responded to provocations in public. While others tried to box her into labels or provoke her with dramatic questions, she remained focused. She once said, "Look at the world. It's noisy, but noise doesn't build." She wasn't distracted by the show. She was shaping outcomes, quietly, steadily, permanently, just like you. Let me tell you about Callan Rivers, a freelance brand designer who was constantly overlooked at her agency by louder, flashier co-workers. She didn't fight for the spotlight. She refined her craft, invested in new tools, built relationships silently. When the company lost a major client, Callan stepped in with a polished rebrand, something she'd been working on quietly for weeks. It not only saved the account, but landed her a personal contract worth more than her annual salary. The co-workers who mocked her, they had no idea she'd already written the end before they even knew there was a problem. That's what you did. While they performed for approval, you produced results in silence. They mistook your calm for confusion, but your calm was construction. Your quiet was engineering. You weren't reacting. You were recording, rewiring, and repositioning. Every subtle insult, every strategic omission, every eye roll and sarcastic laugh, they didn't realize they were placing bricks in the foundation of your next breakthrough. They assumed you were out of the loop, but you were already beyond the loop, redrawing the blueprint entirely. Psalm 37:7 says, "Be still before the Lord and wait patiently for him. Do not fret when people succeed in their ways, when they carry out their wicked schemes." That's what you embodied, not anxious stillness, strategic stillness. You waited, not for their downfall, but for your emergence. And when the time came, it was so clean, so precise, so elegant, they didn't even realize the curtain had dropped until the applause wasn't for them. You didn't scream when it was time to win. You didn't gloat. You didn't point fingers. You just stepped forward. And as you did, every room shifted, every lie unraveled, every smirk faded, because the one they thought was asleep was actually awake in every way that mattered. You weren't trying to prove anything. You were just waiting for the divine release. And when it came, they weren't just unprepared, they were irrelevant. That's not vengeance. That's divine mastery. That's what happens when a chosen one refuses to match noise with noise and instead writes the script while everyone else is busy performing. The real plot twist? They thought they had the spotlight, but it was your stage all along. They truly believed they were leading the story. And you let them. You made them think the spotlight was theirs, the script already set, and the outcome inevitable. They thought they were the protagonist, the one in control, the center of attention. But little did they know, the stage they stood on was one you built, and the narrative they clung to was one you quietly revised while they reveled in their illusion of dominance. That's what made your move so devastating. It wasn't aggressive, it was artful. While they celebrated temporary victories, you were backstage writing the real ending. How often have you smiled knowingly while someone mistook your silence for surrender? How many times have you nodded and stepped aside, not because they were stronger, but because you were wiser? This strategy isn't born from pride. It's born from understanding divine timing. Ecclesiastes 3:1 says, "To everything there is a season, and a time to every purpose under the heaven." You knew the time would come to turn the page, but first you let them write themselves into a corner. It wasn't just patience, it was prophecy. You allowed them to star in a play they thought they controlled, unaware that the true author was you all along, guided by the author of all. Even Jesus, when he stood before Pilate, didn't argue to prove his authority. He remained still. Why? Because truth doesn't panic when it's in the presence of deception, and neither did you. You didn't need to outshout them, outshine them, or even outmaneuver them. You simply redirected the story through stillness, calculation, and timing. Let me tell you about Shonda Rhimes, one of the most influential TV writers of our generation. She created massive hits like Grey's Anatomy and Scandal, yet for years she was doubted, ignored, and underestimated in an industry dominated by men. But rather than fight with noise, she wrote, quietly, powerfully. By the time the world caught up, she wasn't just part of the story. She had become the storyteller, the architect of narratives no one could deny. Her silence wasn't surrender, it was preparation. In a similar way, you let your enemies believe they were building something powerful against you. You even helped them stack the bricks. You offered smiles, agreed to their terms, fed their pride just enough to make them overconfident. You didn't confront their arrogance, you curated it. Not because you feared it, but because you understood something they didn't. Sometimes the greatest judgment is allowing a person to walk into their own trap, willingly. I once knew a woman named Delana Mirel. She worked in a non-profit organization, always overlooked for promotions. Her co-workers would joke about her behind her back, assuming her kindness was weakness. But while they were making moves, Delana was building relationships quietly, compiling reports, and learning systems no one else understood. When the director stepped down, it was Delana, not the loudest voice, who was offered the role. She didn't fight for the throne. The throne found her because she had prepared for it silently, behind the scenes. You've done the same. You studied their behavior. You analyzed every self-congratulatory move. You didn't sabotage. You didn't manipulate. You simply let the game unfold, trusting that arrogance would overextend itself. And when it did, you didn't have to push them over the edge. They ran there themselves, drunk on the illusion of control. Like a spider weaving its web with quiet precision, you set the stage not for entrapment, but for revelation. Psalm 7:15 echoes your approach. He made a pit and dug it out, and has fallen into the ditch which he made. They thought they'd written your downfall, but all they'd done was write their own ending with ink you provided. Think of a wave, silent at first, gathering strength far out in the ocean. It doesn't need to roar to be powerful, but when the time is right, it crashes forward with undeniable force. That was your move. Smooth, sudden, scripted by wisdom. By the time they realized the plot twist, you were already living in the next chapter. They didn't just lose position, they lost relevance. Not because you silenced them, but because their own noise drowned them out. You didn't need to prove your brilliance. You let time tell the truth. You let the story speak for itself. And that's the beauty of being underestimated. While they perform, you prepare. While they gloat, you grow. And when the curtain rises for the final act, you step forward, not as a character in their tale, but as the author of your own. Your vision wasn't just clear, it was divine, and that's why they choked on the altitude. You weren't too intense, you were just too elevated. While others were comfortable breathing low-level air, you were living in a higher frequency, a spiritual elevation that made people dizzy when they tried to keep up. The moment you walked into the room, the vibration changed. Not because you were loud, but because your presence whispered things their pride didn't want to hear. They tried to dismiss you, call you too much, too deep, too intense. But none of those labels were accurate. The truth is, you were functioning at a bandwidth they simply weren't wired to comprehend. And that made you feel like a problem to them before you ever said a word. Think of Elisha in 2 Kings 6:17. When surrounded by an enemy army, his servant panicked. But Elisha prayed, "O Lord, open his eyes so that he may see." And suddenly, the servant saw chariots of fire surrounding them. The army had been there all along, he just couldn't see it. Isn't that how it's been for you? You saw things others couldn't, felt things they dismissed, moved according to signs they didn't even know were there. It wasn't drama, it wasn't overthinking, it was divine sensitivity. While they were stuck in emotional loops, petty cycles, ego games, shallow competition, you were moving in layers, multi-dimensional awareness. You weren't responding to what they said, you were responding to what their spirit broadcasted when their mouth was silent. That's why you kept seeing through people. It wasn't paranoia, it was perception. They thought they were playing chess, or at best checkers, but you had already packed up that board, burned the pieces, and graduated to a different arena. They were confused by your quiet, threatened by your boundaries, frustrated by your refusal to explain every move. But how do you explain color to someone who's only ever seen in grayscale? Albert Einstein, one of the greatest physicists in history, once said, "Great spirits have always encountered violent opposition from mediocre minds." He was often misunderstood, criticized for thinking beyond his generation's comfort zone. But he didn't descend to explain every formula to those who refused to do the math. And neither did you. And then there's the story of Jalen Vero, a strategist in a small tech firm. No one took him seriously because he spoke softly, observed more than he contributed in meetings. But what no one realized was that Jalen was solving systems problems in his head, charting future structures, while others were stuck discussing last week's numbers. When the company faced a digital crisis, Jalen had already mapped the solution and presented it with such precision that the CEO promoted him directly above his doubters. They were playing politics. He was designing systems. You've walked the same way. Quiet, intentional, elevated. And every time someone tried to pull you back down into arguments, gossip, or confusion, you felt the spiritual suffocation. Not because you thought you were better, but because your spirit had outgrown the air they were breathing. Isaiah 40:31 says, "But those who hope in the Lord will renew their strength. They will soar on wings like eagles." That's your calling, to fly, to rise, not to beg for understanding from those who refuse to lift their gaze. And yes, they accused you of being hard to deal with. But what they really meant was, "I can't control you." They labeled you difficult, but that's how people describe anything they can't define. You weren't being vague. You were being deliberate. You weren't hiding. You were protecting what they hadn't earned the right to access. Your vision required altitude. Your purpose demanded silence. And your peace. It was non-negotiable. That's why you stopped over-explaining. Not everyone deserves a map to where you're going, especially if they have no intention of growing. Imagine a falcon in flight. It doesn't hover in flocks. It doesn't flap wildly to be seen. It soars high, scanning from altitudes where the noise of the earth no longer reaches. You've been flying like that, above the drama, beyond the distractions. They didn't fall away because you became something foreign. They fell away because they couldn't breathe in the atmosphere you now inhabit. They were designed for comfort. You were designed for clarity. They chase applause. You chase alignment. They wanted control. You sought calling. You didn't lose them. You simply stopped shrinking to fit their understanding. You chose evolution over explanation. And that's why, by the time they realized the altitude had shifted, you were already gone, higher, freer, and finally at peace. Because altitude isn't for everyone, and you, chosen one, were never created to live on the ground. You mastered something they never expected, strategic invisibility. And while they assumed your silence meant weakness, what they didn't know was that you had simply shifted dimensions. You weren't absent. You were armored in stillness. Not gone, just repositioned. You disappeared from view not to retreat, but to recalibrate. It wasn't silence born of defeat. It was silence wrapped in discipline. They called you quiet. But you weren't quiet. You were calculating. You didn't vanish. You were ghosting distractions, detaching from environments that diluted your discernment. While they craved the spotlight, you studied the shadows. How else could you prepare a divine strike with such accuracy? They thought you stepped back because you were intimidated. But what if the truth is, you simply refused to waste revelation on ears not ready to hear? This was the wisdom of Jesus himself. When the crowd tried to force him into kingship prematurely, he slipped away. John 6:15. He didn't stay to argue. He moved quietly, deliberately, because even the Messiah chose timing over applause. You've learned the same rhythm. You don't show up to be seen. You show up when it's time to shift the atmosphere. They couldn't read you because you trained yourself to be unreadable. Loud voices get targeted, visible threats get neutralized, but the most dangerous ones, they're the ones hidden in plain sight, those building silently, preparing quietly, becoming unshakable while no one is watching. Amal Clooney, a renowned international human rights lawyer, isn't one to dominate headlines with noise, but her presence shifts courtrooms and global policy. While others sought camera flashes, she sought justice, precision, dignity. Her silence was never void. It was saturated with strategy. You've moved the same way. You weren't missing, you were mastering. And I'll tell you about Brielle Santana, a marketing intern in a media company who suddenly disappeared from office circles. While her peers laughed at her absence, she was learning coding at night, pitching side campaigns under a pen name, and consulting under a different brand. A year later, when she returned, she was hired as the creative director for the very agency that once overlooked her. They were too busy watching her leave to notice she was returning transformed. So what if they thought you faded? Let them, because while they were refreshing social feeds looking for proof of your presence, you were uploading something far more eternal. Purpose. You weren't hiding. You were harvesting. Every quiet season wasn't a void. It was a vault. You weren't sleeping. You were storing, evolving, upgrading. Proverbs 17:28 says, "Even fools are thought wise if they keep silent, and discerning if they hold their tongues." But your silence went beyond wisdom. It became a weapon, not of violence, but of vision. And the battlefield? It's always tilted in favor of the one who disappears long enough to re-emerge with a map. They expected you to fight loud battles, to show every move, to speak before thinking. But you learned to become the fog, the unseen force that confuses opponents, blinds the prideful, and shields the chosen. You weren't absent from the fight. You just didn't fight on their terms. Imagine the stillness of the moon during an eclipse. It doesn't beg to be seen. It simply aligns with divine order. And suddenly, the entire world notices. That's how your return felt. Not forced, not loud, but impossible to ignore. Because when you came back, it wasn't to impress, it was to implement. You weren't after attention, you were after authority. And now that you're here, you don't just ask for a seat at the table. You bring your own blueprint, your own tools, and build the entire room. They couldn't see your transformation happening because they weren't tuned to the frequency of faith. But that's all right, because you never needed to be remembered to be relevant. You just needed time to sharpen the sword. And now, you move with heaven's permission, not man's applause. That's the gift of strategic invisibility. It's not hiding. It's choosing when to appear and why. You didn't disappear. You ascended. They chased clout, but you, God's chosen one, you were never chasing noise. You were planting purpose. They wanted to be seen for a second. You were building something that would be remembered for generations. That's why your silence was never empty. It was sacred. It wasn't for show. It was for strategy. They went viral. You went vertical. While they danced for reactions, while they tailored their every move to fit into a frame for others to double tap, you moved differently. You weren't chasing attention. You were building atmosphere. They performed. You transformed. You didn't need to shout, because what you were shaping in silence would speak for itself when the time was right. And when it did, it wouldn't just speak. It would shift rooms, shift narratives, shift timelines. What if your entire delay was never punishment, but preparation for permanence? Look at Nehemiah. When enemies mocked him for rebuilding the wall around Jerusalem, they sent letters to distract him. He replied in Nehemiah 6:3, "I am doing a great work, and I cannot come down." That's exactly what you did. You didn't come down to argue. You didn't stoop to shade. You stayed focused, brick by brick, vision over validation. Your revenge wasn't a response, it was results. And results whisper what arguments can't scream. Reminds me of Dr. Bernice King, daughter of Martin Luther King Jr. While many activists turned to social media outbursts and headlines, she built legacy through education, reform, and silent strength. She once said, "Some people chase attention. I'm chasing transformation." She carries a mantle rooted not in clout, but consequence, and you've been doing the same. They came for your name, hoping their comments would shake you, but you weren't protecting just your name. You were rewriting the entire narrative. They wanted screenshots. You built blueprints. They lit matches. You laid foundations. And the moment they tried to drag you into temporary drama, they didn't realize they were helping to elevate your eternal platform. Have you noticed how some people fall in love with moments while others fall in love with meaning? You chose meaning. You chose to build something they'd never be able to enter, not because you excluded them, but because they never had the discipline to stay quiet and do the work. While they were chasing every platform, you became the ground others now stand on. You built, you refined, you waited. Let me tell you about Jonah Elridge. He was just a quiet engineer in a small firm in London. His co-workers gossiped, mocked his silence, and even accused him of being arrogant. But Jonah kept building his side project, an AI prototype that, 1 year later, revolutionized his industry. Today, those same co-workers attend conferences where he's the keynote speaker. He never clapped back. He simply outgrew their level of vision. Isn't that the deeper truth about elevation? It doesn't need to announce itself. It just shows up changed. Your growth didn't shout. It spoke in quiet excellence. Your elevation didn't make noise. It made impact. And when you rose, it wasn't an explosion. It was an expansion. Gradual, undeniable, irreversible. Proverbs 22:29 says, "Do you see a man skilled in his work? He will stand before kings. He will not stand before obscure men." That was you. Your skill became your shield. Your focus became your fortress. While they begged for applause, you just needed time. And when your time came, heaven didn't announce it. It simply made room for it. Imagine a tree growing deep roots in silence. No one sees it beneath the soil. No one applauds it. But one day the trunk breaks through the earth, and not even a storm can uproot it. That's your legacy. You were growing roots while others chased light. You didn't drag them down. You outgrew them. And that chosen one is a victory most can't comprehend, because your aim was never to prove them wrong. It was to become so rooted, so unshakably right, that even your silence carried weight. You didn't just win. You made their words irrelevant by becoming unforgettable. They wanted a moment. You became a movement. They fought for exposure. You embodied evolution. And now they don't even know how to explain your rise because it doesn't fit their narrative. It's too divine, too clean, too undeniable. That's not revenge. That's legacy. And that's exactly what you were born to leave behind. You didn't clap back. You rerouted the storm with precision. While they were hoping to see you flinch, to bait you into battle, you calmly let the current shift in your favor. They expected chaos, but you delivered consequences. They planned drama, you planted strategy. Every move you made was deliberate. No rants, no online exposure, no screaming in public places. Just clean, cutting silence. And that silence, it wasn't absence. It was a scalpel. They came looking for a show, but you gave them a mirror instead. And isn't that far more haunting, to force someone to face themselves? They wanted you to break. You chose to build. They wanted an argument. You built an altar, because instead of reacting, you redirected. You saw the trap. You sensed the setup. They were designing a narrative where you'd become the villain of their play, but you refused to perform. You rewrote the script. This is exactly what Jesus did when he stood before Pilate. In Matthew 27:14, it says, "But Jesus made no reply, not even to a single charge, to the great amazement of the governor." Do you see the power of divine silence? It confuses those who thrive on chaos. That's why your silence wasn't weakness, it was weaponry. Your silence made noise in their heads. It echoed louder than any statement, because silence, when it comes from confidence, not fear, becomes its own form of warfare. And you knew that every insult they threw, every slanderous word, every manipulative move wasn't destroying you. It was exposing them. You didn't just watch, you documented, and then you acted, not emotionally, but surgically. Let's take the story of Pope John Paul II, one of the most respected spiritual leaders of our time. In 1981, after an assassination attempt that nearly killed him, he did something no one expected. He forgave the man who shot him. Quietly, personally, not for applause, not for a press headline, but because he understood the divine cycle of justice. He didn't fight with hate. He redirected the outcome with grace. You've walked that same path. You didn't lash out. You let life do the lifting. You understood that revenge isn't always a strike. It's elevation. And sometimes the best clapback is becoming so far removed from their level that they can't even reach the bottom of your breakthrough. You knew that karma doesn't need an assistant. It just needs a clear path. And your silence cleared the runway. You set the coordinates, and life delivered. How many times did they think they had the final word, only to find themselves cornered by their own cruelty? Let me tell you about Caleb Rios, a rising visual artist in Sao Paulo. His colleagues mocked him for being too spiritual, too reserved. They stole his ideas and spread lies. But Caleb said nothing. Instead, he refined his technique and poured his pain into his work. 1 year later, one of his stolen designs went viral, not because of them, but because he quietly released the original. The world saw the truth. No scandal, just recognition, just results. That's what happened with you. While they were scrambling for attention, you became alignment. You didn't need to defend your name. You let fruit speak louder than opinion. You turned every slight into strength, every attack into advancement, and every insult. It became fertilizer for your next elevation. Imagine a hawk flying high above a pack of barking dogs. The noise never reaches the altitude. That's what you did. You ascended above the nonsense. You didn't shout over them. You rose until their volume became irrelevant. Romans 12:19 says, "Do not take revenge, my dear friends, but leave room for God's wrath, for it is written, 'It is mine to avenge, I will repay,' says the Lord." That's what you trusted in. Not retaliation, but timing. Not clapping back, but climbing higher. And when your breakthrough arrived, it didn't come with confetti, it came with confirmation. While they were looking for an explosion, your blessing arrived like morning light, quiet, consistent, undeniable. By the time they realized what had happened, it was too late. You had already turned their drama into destiny. They wanted a war. You gave them a mirror. They wanted reaction. You became revelation. You didn't just refuse to stoop to their level. You built an entirely different floor and locked the door behind you. That's the power of divine restraint. That's the strength of someone who doesn't react, but rebuilds. You were never trying to get even. You were focused on becoming excellent. And what's better than revenge? Making their attempts irrelevant. Because in the end, your elevation didn't just silence them, it made you unforgettable. Not because you fought louder, but because you rose higher. That wasn't revenge. That was divine engineering. That was legacy in motion. They studied your every move like disciples gathering fragments of greatness. Every word you spoke, every action you took, they watched it all, convinced that if they copied the surface, they could unlock the secret. But they never understood one truth. Skill can be seen, but intention is hidden. And you, chosen one, weren't moving with flair. You were moving with purpose. While they mimicked your rhythm, you were interpreting their reason. They clapped when you won, but you were watching who looked around first before clapping. Because envy doesn't always throw rocks. It often smiles first. And some of the most dangerous observers don't boo from the crowd. They cheer from the front row. You didn't panic. You didn't call them out. You let them linger. Because you understood that wisdom isn't just knowing who's watching. It's discerning why they're watching. Were they admiring you or measuring you? Were they drawn by curiosity or competition? That's where your vision became prophetic. You were trained to read behind the performance. Doesn't this remind you of Jesus at the Last Supper? He didn't expose Judas with a scream or a curse. He simply said, "One of you will betray me." Matthew 26:21. And while the disciples questioned each other, Jesus already knew who it was. He had already studied the motive beneath the loyalty. That's the same discernment you've been walking in. They thought they were following you, but you had already left the trail. Imagine a tiger watching a hunter with binoculars. The hunter thinks he's in control, but the tiger is 5 steps ahead, silent, still, and calculating. That's how you moved. With precision, with spiritual clarity. While they stalked your style, you dissected their spirit. Let's talk about Steve Jobs, the visionary behind Apple. Known for his minimalist genius, he once said, "People think focus means saying yes to the thing you've got to focus on, but that's not what it means at all. It means saying no to 100 other good ideas." Jobs wasn't successful because of his moves. He was successful because of his motives, his unseen obsession with innovation, not imitation. That's the difference. And that's what you understood. Your enemy was never their imitation. It was the intention behind it. You didn't chase respect. You decoded energy. You read the room like a sacred manuscript. You clocked every micro-expression, every delayed compliment, every fake smile paired with too many questions. I'll tell you about Serena Beck, a young entrepreneur from Seoul. She ran a handmade jewelry business, and suddenly one of her followers started copying her designs. Same colors, same layout, even the same captions. But Serena didn't get angry. She noticed that the copycat never understood the story behind each piece. So Serena pivoted. She added a secret engraving, a verse on the inside only the buyer would know. Her brand exploded. The imitator faded. Because when you move with divine intention, even a copy can't keep up. You did the same. You didn't block them out. You let them think they had access, all the while taking notes. You watched when their energy shifted. You saw when admiration turned into obsession, when interest became intimidation. And in that moment, you knew it wasn't just that they were watching your hands, they were missing your heart. Proverbs 4:23 warns, "Above all else, guard your heart, for everything you do flows from it." You've been guarding yours while reading theirs. That's not fear. That's spiritual discernment. That's why you were always 2 moves ahead. You weren't just reacting to what they did. You were studying why they did it. And when it came time to shift, you didn't just walk away. You outgrew the entire situation. You moved with such clarity, such excellence, such divine momentum that they didn't just lose your trail. They lost the meaning behind their mimicry. They played with checklists. You navigated with conviction. They wore masks. You saw through them. That's not paranoia. That's prophetic vision. That's precision. And that's why they'll never see your next move coming. Because you never just studied the steps. You studied the soul behind them. You didn't defeat them with noise. You outlasted them with something infinitely rarer. Self-discipline. While others chose spectacle, you chose strategy. While they burned their energy trying to be seen, you preserved yours by becoming solid. They chased moments. You forged mastery. They never stood a chance, not because you were louder, but because you were rooted deeper. They underestimated what they couldn't imitate, because self-discipline can't be faked. It doesn't come from talent, it comes from training. It's what made you dangerous. While they were constantly reacting, talking too soon, posting too much, panicking over perception, you were practicing restraint. Not because you were weak, but because you were wise enough to know that not every battle is worth your roar. Envy is loud, but mastery. It doesn't need a microphone. It speaks in consistency. It whispers in precision. It echoes through results. And you, chosen one, learned to stay calm even when your name was twisted in places you never stepped into. You didn't need to defend yourself in every room because you were building something too massive to be shaken by gossip. You understood what they didn't. Real power doesn't panic. Real authority doesn't scream. It stands. And in that standing, you revealed everything they tried to cover up about themselves. Do you remember how Jesus stood before Herod? Luke 23:9 says, "He plied him with many questions, but Jesus gave him no answer." Silence wasn't defeat, it was domination. Restraint wasn't weakness. It was a flex heaven understood. You carried that same kind of strength, the kind that doesn't need approval to keep moving. They launched messy attacks, reckless jabs, desperate plays for attention, and each time you didn't respond, it exposed them more. You didn't have to clap back because your character was already clapping forward. Every disciplined move you made was a blow they didn't see coming. They were trying to shake your emotions. You were mastering your focus. And that difference, that was the unbridgeable gap. Nelson Mandela, one of the greatest moral leaders of our time, spent 27 years in prison. He was ridiculed, silenced, and beaten. But when he walked out of that cell, he didn't speak vengeance. He spoke peace. He once said, "I have learned that courage was not the absence of fear, but the triumph over it." Mandela didn't win through noise. He won through enduring silence. That's what you've been doing. You've been training while they've been trying. And then there's Talia, a name no one knew 3 years ago. She was overlooked, mocked by her peers at a tech firm for being too quiet and too methodical. But she never argued, never posted about being treated unfairly. She worked, she learned, she built, and now she owns the company that bought out the firm that once dismissed her. That's self-discipline in action, quiet, unstoppable, undeniable. You didn't rise because you were reactive. You rose because you were consistent when no one was clapping. That's what separates the chosen from the crowd. While they scrambled for short-term wins, you were locking in long-term foundations. While they exploded under pressure, you became pressure. You didn't just survive the fire, you studied it, you timed it, and you stepped out of it with a glow they couldn't match. Isaiah 40:31 promises, "But they that wait upon the Lord shall renew their strength. They shall mount up with wings as eagles." And you've done just that. You didn't just fly, you soared past them while they were still flapping for attention. Picture a volcano beneath a snow-capped mountain, still, silent. But when it moves, it reshapes landscapes. That's you. You weren't holding back because you couldn't strike. You were holding back because you didn't need to. You weren't trying to prove you were powerful. You were becoming the proof itself. And now the very people who mocked your patience are scrambling to figure out how you stayed standing when they fell apart. They confused your silence for softness. They never realized that your quiet was the shield. Your routine was the sword, and your endurance was the weapon that would bury their drama. They burned hot, fast, and loud. But flames like that always burn out. You built slowly, faithfully, intentionally. That's why you're still here. That's why you'll keep showing up long after their noise has faded. Because discipline doesn't just outplay chaos, it outlasts it, every single time. They were driven by resentment, but you, God's chosen one, were fueled by something far deeper, premonition. They moved from wounds that never healed, while you moved from insight that didn't need explanation. And that's why the outcome was never the same. They reacted, you anticipated, they lashed out, you laid low. They misread the silence in you, believing it meant uncertainty, but it was simply alignment with divine timing. You weren't being paranoid, you were being prepared. They mistook your discernment for oversensitivity, your quiet distance for defensiveness. But they didn't realize what you've lived through, how many battles you've survived with no applause and no audience. You didn't need proof, you didn't need confirmation. You felt the shift in their spirit before their behavior ever confirmed it. Like the prophet Elisha in 2 Kings 6, when the king of Syria sent troops to ambush Israel, Elisha already knew their every move. Why? Because the Spirit revealed it. Even the enemy had to ask, "Who among us is for the king of Israel?" But it wasn't a traitor, it was a man of vision. Like Elisha, you saw the ambush coming before they even loaded their weapons. They were driven by old pain. That's why their actions were so wild, so sloppy. And you, grounded in clarity, shaped by wisdom, remained still. They thought they were pushing buttons, but you had already disconnected the panel. You didn't panic when their words grew colder. You recognized that forced laugh, that subtle withdrawal, the way they clapped without conviction. You sensed the venom even in their silence. What if your intuition is just your history speaking in advance? What if your instincts are heaven's way of warning you ahead of time? Even Joseph, thrown into a pit by his own brothers, didn't need them to confess. Their jealousy screamed louder than words, but he didn't fight it. He planned. And years later, when famine hit the land and those same brothers came begging, Joseph was already in position. Because when you're chosen, strategy often looks like silence. This also reminds me of Nelson Mandela, the South African freedom fighter who endured 27 years in prison. Many thought he'd emerge vengeful, but he came out composed, forgiving, calculated. As he once said, "Resentment is like drinking poison and then hoping it will kill your enemies." He had every reason to retaliate, but wisdom kept him ahead. That's how he changed a nation, by responding with vision, not vengeance. And then there's Santiago Rivas. You probably haven't heard of him. He worked in a mid-level tech company in Spain, never loud, never dramatic. But when internal sabotage started, Santiago didn't accuse, he just watched. He gathered timelines, tracked inconsistencies, and when the board finally asked for answers, he calmly pulled out everything, dates, messages, evidence. While others got fired, Santiago got promoted. That wasn't luck. That was quiet calculation. You've walked that same path. While others acted impulsively, driven by their emotional wounds, you moved like a shadow, guided by foresight. Their resentment made them reckless. Your instincts made you surgical. Imagine a falcon gliding high in the sky. It doesn't flap wildly like smaller birds. It circles, watches, waits, and when it dives, it never misses. That's the kind of stillness you moved with, the kind of power that doesn't seek revenge, but understands results speak louder. And when the moment came, you didn't flinch. You didn't warn them. You didn't post a cryptic caption. You let them step right into the consequence they never saw coming, because your insight wasn't driven by ego. It was drawn from experience, from the divine blueprint inside you. Psalm 37:12-13 says, "The wicked plots against the righteous and gnashes at him with his teeth, but the Lord laughs at him, for he sees his day is coming." God showed you what they couldn't hide. You were never confused. You were just collecting proof with your spirit. And in the end, they lost a game they thought they were playing alone. They thought their hatred gave them the upper hand, but it gave them a pattern. And you read that pattern like a prophet reads the sky. Because when you're built from wisdom and not wounds, you don't need to shout. You move exactly when it's time. And that's what separates those who react from those who reign. You didn't need revenge. You became the storm they swore would never come. They underestimated the quiet one. They forgot that storms don't shout warnings. They gather silently in the distance, then arrive with power no one can contain. While they plotted, whispered, and waited for you to crack, you were becoming something they never had the discipline to become. Transformed. You didn't mirror their energy. You absorbed it. You metabolized it. And you evolved past it. That's what set you apart. While they hoped their sabotage, their silence, their carefully delivered shade would delay your growth. You were building momentum. They expected you to break. They wanted to see you spiral, to watch you fold under the weight of their attacks. But instead, you rose, layer by layer, decision by decision, into the version of yourself that not even they could deny. Like Jesus in Luke 23:34, when he looked down from the cross and said, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do." That wasn't weakness. That was ultimate power, divine restraint. Because real storms don't respond with destruction, they respond with purpose. And like Christ, you didn't need to retaliate. Your destiny was already writing the answer. Every insult you endured became your material. Every fake smile, every backhanded compliment, every door they closed in your face. You didn't just survive it, you refined it. You burned it down in the furnace of discipline and turned it into fuel. Quietly, strategically, without a single dramatic display. They expected noise, but you gave them legacy. That's the difference. They were playing short-term games, hoping for an emotional reaction they could twist into their narrative. But you gave them ascension instead. Not because you wanted to prove them wrong, but because your calling was always bigger than their opinions. Do you remember the story of Nehemiah rebuilding the wall? As he worked, his enemies mocked him, tried to distract him, even sent threats. But Nehemiah didn't come down. He said in Nehemiah 6:3, "I am doing a great work and I cannot come down." That was you. You didn't come down to their level. You didn't match their chaos. You stayed high. Because the vision God gave you was too valuable to be traded for petty wars. And then there's J.K. Rowling, the world-famous author of Harry Potter. She was rejected by 12 publishers, dismissed as a single mother on welfare with unmarketable ideas. But she didn't fight back. She didn't go on rants or defend herself in interviews. She just kept writing. And when the world finally caught up to her vision, her silence became the loudest success story. That's what you've done too. Let your evolution speak. Let me tell you about Elias Donovan. No press, no spotlight. Just a former retail worker who started journaling at night instead of lashing out at co-workers who belittled him. A year later, those same co-workers walked into a bookstore and saw his name on the cover. He didn't clap back, he created impact. And the silence they thought was weakness, that was preparation. That's the kind of transformation you chose. While they were obsessed with your reaction, you were becoming unrecognizable, sharper, stronger, more refined. And when you arrived, it wasn't with fireworks or fury. It was with focus, with undeniable weight, with grace that didn't need to be loud to shift the atmosphere. Picture a tidal wave forming on the horizon. It's not chaotic, it doesn't scream, it just gathers power until it touches the shore, and nothing fake survives the contact. That's what you became, not karma, not revenge, a reminder, a shift, a reckoning, a realignment. They tried to write you off, but you rewrote the ending. You didn't need receipts. You didn't need to clap back or expose anyone. You became the living proof that what was meant to destroy you only polished you. You didn't return fire, you became fire. You didn't descend into their storm. You were the storm, and not the kind that tears everything down, but the kind that clears the sky so the truth can finally shine through. They'll never forget it, not because you hurt them, but because you healed. And healing in public when they expected you to crumble is the loudest thunder they'll ever hear. They moved impulsively. You moved with quantum foresight. They clung to the rules. You rewrote them in invisible ink. They were obsessed with controlling the next move, but you had already seen 5 steps ahead. That's the difference between playing to survive and playing to shift reality. Just like Joseph in Genesis 50:20, who told his brothers, "You meant evil against me, but God meant it for good, to bring about that many people should be kept alive." His strategy wasn't revenge, it was vision. He didn't just endure betrayal, he architected salvation out of it. That's exactly how you moved, transforming attacks into blueprints, using opposition as elevation. Their plans were flat, driven by ego. Yours were deep, driven by destiny. And while they were calculating exposure, you were mastering invisibility, not as an escape, but as a weapon. They tried to pull you into petty battles, into black and white arguments, but you saw shades, frequencies, fractures in reality where growth could take root unseen. You didn't come to react, you came to reframe. Think of a raven soaring over a battlefield. It doesn't enter the chaos. It flies above it, watching every detail, seeing the whole terrain from a higher vantage point. That's you. You didn't just study the players, you studied the patterns. And when the board twisted, it was because you bent the very laws they thought governed the game. Even the Pharisees couldn't understand Jesus when he operated outside their expected dimensions. In Matthew 22, when they tried to trap him with questions about taxes, he responded with, "Render to Caesar what is Caesar's, and to God what is God's." That wasn't just an answer. It was a paradigm shift, a move they never anticipated. Sound familiar? Now consider Angela Merkel, the former Chancellor of Germany. Soft-spoken, often underestimated, she mastered the global political stage not by aggression, but by long-term strategy. Behind every pause was calculation. She once said, "Look at the world as a whole, not just individual crises." That's the level you've operated on, seeing the whole board while they obsess over single squares. And there's also Malik Osei, a quiet systems analyst from Ghana, whose team tried to isolate him during a merger. They thought he'd fade into irrelevance, but Malik studied the entire system architecture in silence. When the new CTO was hired and demanded an audit, it was Malik who walked in with a full redesign, seamless, efficient, revolutionary. He didn't defend himself, he redefined the game. That's how you've moved, chosen one. You didn't raise your voice, you raised your value. You didn't fight for a seat at their table, you redesigned the floor plan. You didn't compete within their old systems. You outgrew them until the systems had to recalibrate around you. Isaiah 55:8-9 reminds us, For my thoughts are not your thoughts, neither are your ways my ways, declares the Lord. As the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways. That divine mindset is exactly what you've embraced. You stop trying to be understood by small minds playing small games. Instead, you anchored yourself in the higher ways of wisdom and vision. They misread your calm as cluelessness. They saw your silence and mistook it for simplicity. But every quiet step you took was part of a map only you held. Every still moment was a calibration of the next dimension you were unfolding. And when they finally realized what was happening, the game was already over. Not with explosions, not with spectacle, but with precision so clean, so calculated, it was undeniable. You didn't seek to match their fire. You mastered the wind. You didn't run from their traps. You dissolved them before they were even built. You moved with prophetic knowing, divine calculation, and emotional maturity that left no room for small games. In a world chasing attention, you chased alignment. While they were distracted by noise, you were crafting legacy. And legacy, unlike popularity, cannot be erased by gossip. You didn't become great by fighting for visibility. You became great by staying loyal to vision. You are not of this world's pattern. You are not here to fit within their rules. You are here to change the rules entirely. You're not just the player they underestimated. You're the author of the game they'll spend a lifetime trying to understand. Let them watch. Let them plot. Let them misunderstand the silence. Because you've already entered the dimension where real power exists. You've already won because you weren't playing for applause. You were operating in a realm only those with foresight can reach. And now you understand. Being God's chosen one was never about proving yourself in the spotlight. It was about becoming unshakable in the silence. You didn't win because you shouted louder. You won because you listened deeper, thought clearer, and moved wiser. They underestimated the power of stillness. They overlooked the strength of foresight, but heaven didn't. You were never just reacting to life. You were rewriting the blueprint. Every storm you passed through, every trap you avoided, every silent decision you made, it was shaping something eternal. You didn't just play their game, you transcended it. Because you are not ordinary, you are called, you are chosen. You are already walking in a dimension they don't even believe exists. So let them talk, let them scheme, let them watch. Because the masterpiece God is painting through you wasn't meant to be understood by small minds. It was meant to be witnessed. If this message spoke to your spirit, don't keep it to yourself. Share it. Comment 777 below as a sign that you're walking in divine strategy, not emotional reaction. And to all of you who've supported this channel through your super thanks and kind encouragement, we see you, we honor you, and may your seeds return to you in ways only heaven can orchestrate. If you haven't already, subscribe to the channel so you never miss what God is revealing next. Like the video, turn on the notification bell, and help us spread this word by sharing it with someone who needs to hear it right now. May the Lord bless you with discernment that sees beyond the surface, with strategy that no enemy can decode, and with the kind of peace that terrifies the chaos around you. You are not behind. You are not forgotten. You are not ordinary. You are chosen, and the game was already yours. Until next time, stay sharp, stay hidden, stay blessed.